Okay, I'm gonna let him in now from the waiting room.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Glad you all can make it out tonight for Diego Velázquez. You're in for a real treat with Ann Betty Weinshenker. I'd like to ask all of you to please mute yourself to start out with. We'll take questions after she's completed her talk. And also like to remind everyone to please be courteous to her as she's talking. Please, monitor, make sure again, like please mute yourself, make sure there's no background noise as she goes along. If anyone cannot see her presentation right now, please let me know by raising your hands. If you know the hand raise function on your toolbar, please let us know if you cannot see her presentation at the moment. Since I don't see any raised hands, I assume everything is okay. So I'm going to spotlight Ann Betty when she starts talking, so you'll see her and her presentation. If there's any issues with that, please use the chat window to make that known to us, please. Okay, so I'm going to start with an introduction. Actually, I have a few coming in from the weight room, so we're gonna let them come in first before we start it. Okay, so there are a few in, so I'm going to begin with a little introduction here. For introduction, Ann Betty Weinshenker holds a PhD in art history from Columbia University. She's also a professor emerita of art history from the Department of Art and Design from Montclair State University. She has held many art talks for us in the past. Please, everyone, please mute yourself. I'm gonna do this right now. Okay, so again, please be courteous to her as she's talking. Please do not let background noise in as we're continuing as we go through the talk. As I was saying, Ann Betty Weinshenker has led many talks with us in the past. We always welcome her back for her great talks. You're in for a treat tonight. So take it away, Ann Betty. We're ready to go.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. As you can see, the title not only has the name of the artist we're featuring, Diego Velázquez, but also that he is, in fact, the premier artist of what is called the Spanish Golden Age. And in fact, the Golden Age of Spanish art refers to the fact that there was a great flourishing in the 1600s, in the 17th century, of art in Spain. Elsewhere in Europe too, but in Spain, it was a particularly active period in terms of artistic production, not only visual arts, painting primarily, but also in literature. This was, of course, the era when Don Quixote was written by Miguel de Cervantes, and there were other literary works as well. So there was a very active upsurge of artistic activity in the 17th century in Spain, much more so than either before or after this era. For a long time afterwards, Spain went into a kind of artistic doldrum and didn't emerge really until the 19th century again. Anyway, Velázquez is the most impressive and in many ways the greatest artist of this golden age of Spanish art. He was born in the South Spanish city of Seville. Seville at that time, why is this not moving? Oh dear. Let's see. trying to get it to go and it's not going.
It's not responding to the arrows in, Betty?
It's not moving to the next slide. I never had that problem before. It's stuck on the front page and I've got lots of slides.
Go to your toolbar
Yeah.
and go to the bottom end of the toolbar. It should see a slideshow
Oh,
option.
arrow. Yeah, there's
Yes.
an arrow. Oops. Let's see if that works. Okay. All right. I'll use that instead. Thank you. Okay. He was sent to learn how to paint, to become an apprentice at a very early age. He was only about 11 years old, to the studio of a leading artist in Seville. And Seville was a flourishing and well-to-do city at that time. The artist was Francisco Pacheco. Pacheco was one of the most important artists in Seville at the time. And not only an artist, but also a theoretician. He wrote a book called The Art of Painting, which still is very informative about the ideas that were prevalent about art in Spain at the time. Velázquez was 19 when he made the painting on the right. And on the left, I put a painting by Pacheco. They both are of the same subject, the Immaculate Conception, which refers to a doctrine that was very, very important in the city of Seville. The city of Seville was, in fact, dedicated to the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, which refers to the fact that the Virgin herself was born without sin, that the Virgin was immaculately conceived. And this doctrine was extremely important as a very, very profoundly religious idea in the city of Seville, and in fact, in many other parts of Spain, but especially in Seville. Now, as you can see, the Velázquez was made only a fairly short time, within a year or two after the Pacheco, but it's interesting to see the difference. Obviously, Velázquez knew Pacheco's painting. They have basically the same elements, the Virgin Mary, who, according to the book that Pacheco wrote, is supposed to be a young girl of 12 or 13 years old. She doesn't really look like that in Pacheco's painting, but she does in the painting by Velázquez. We have a sense that Velázquez must have used a live model, and the Pacheco painting does not seem very much like it used a live model. According to the Book of Revelations, which is the basis for this image, she stands on the moon. She has the moon beneath her feet, and she has a crown of stars around her head. The glow of the sun is behind her, and there are various symbols around that relate to her, like the flowers in the Pacheco and the chalice in the painting by Velázquez. And the figure is in the same pose. Again, obviously, Velázquez has looked at his teacher's painting, but he has clearly made it more real looking. It looks like a real young girl. And the sky around also with the clouds looks more real as well. This is an element that we will see as a consistent feature of Velázquez's art, this concern with the real, with reality, even when he is dealing with an otherworldly subject. Let's see. How do I get down to we can see that very clearly what is behind Velázquez's turn to the real. If we see what was going on in Italian art about the time that he was beginning to paint in Spain. In the 16th century, especially the first quarter to third of the 16th century was the art movement that is generally known as the Renaissance. And one of the greatest painters of the Italian Renaissance was Raphael, who made the painting on the left of the marriage of the Virgin Mary, being married to Saint Joseph. It is a typical Renaissance painting in that the figures look perfect. They're ideal. They're graceful. They don't have a great deal of individuality. They all pretty much look alike. The faces of the women on the left look alike, and the faces of the men on the right are very similar. And the figures spread across the painting from side to side in a kind of frieze fashion, while, and this is typical of Italian Renaissance, there is an extension behind them into the far distance. You look along the paving stones that retreat into the distance and end with this image of the temple in the background. That was the kind of art that was produced in the Renaissance and in many ways continued throughout the rest of the 16th century. But at the very end of the 16th century, a brilliant painter named Michelangelo Merisi, who came from the North Italian town of Caravaggio and is therefore known as Caravaggio, began to paint in a totally different way. The painting on the right of the biblical story of the supper at Emmaus, where after Christ has been resurrected, he appears at an inn with to the people who are eating there at the inn, and they suddenly realize that they are sharing their supper table with the risen Christ. Now, this painting is extraordinarily different from the Renaissance painting as exemplified by Raphael, in that, for one thing, the figures are not ideal. They are not perfect. They look very real, from the image of the Jesus Christ figure himself to the others who are around. This is a result of the effort by the Catholic Church at the time of the Counter-Reformation to make art an instrument to bring people back into the Catholic Church at a time when many, many of them had been converted to Protestantism. The Protestant Revolution had taken place beginning in the second decade of the 16th century and continued throughout the 16th century. Many members of the Catholic Church had left and been converted to Protestantism, and the Catholic Church mounted what is called the Catholic Counter-Reformation to try to bring people back into the Catholic Church. And they specifically stated that art was to be one way to bring people back. So by showing figures in the holy stories as looking like ordinary everyday people with clothing that might be torn and ragged, with very ordinary everyday faces and scruffy hair, it made these paintings more accessible to those who would be seeing the paintings and therefore being able to see that the holy figures of the Bible were like themselves and they could come back. Caravaggio's art was perfect for that purpose. In addition, he wanted to make sure that anybody who looked at these figures would be able to very clearly enter into the painting himself. The painting reaches out into the world of the spectator. It doesn't extend into the back, deep into the distance. It has a back wall that keeps us from going too far, unlike the distance in the Renaissance painting. And the figures in the painting reach out into the real world, the elbow, the hand, as if to bring us back, to bring the spectator back into the work, to make us part of the work and participate in the scene rather than simply being in front of it and looking at it. We are actually in it. This was an innovation introduced by Caravaggio and picked up, as we will see, by Velázquez as well. Now, another very important element in Caravaggio's work is the very strong contrasts of dark and light. Brilliant highlights on parts of the work and deep darkness and shadows on others. That creates a sense of drama in the work, and it's something that Velázquez also was adopting from the work of Caravaggio. Now, Velázquez had not seen probably any of Caravaggio's paintings at the time he made this painting of the same scene, but there were copies of Caravaggio's paintings. Here's the Caravaggio again, of course. There were copies available, and Velázquez must undoubtedly have known what Caravaggio's work was like, because we see a lot of the same elements. The sense of ordinary everyday people, the guests at the inn who are suddenly struck with amazement when they realize that they are seated at table with the risen Christ, who has in fact the stigmata, the sign of the nail hole in his hand, as proof that he is the risen Christ. The fact that these figures are not extending into depth, but there is a dark wall behind them, as in the Caravaggio painting. And then the reaching out into the space in front of them where the spectator stands, where we stand. So this brings us into the work. This makes us part of what is going on and makes us feel as though we are part of the scene. That all of those innovations of Caravaggio are adopted by Velázquez, and we will see Velázquez using such elements again and again in his works, but with his own spin on them, with his own elements introduced into them. The quality of realism that is introduced into Spanish art in the early 17th century, even before Velázquez, comes not only from Caravaggio, but from the work of a couple of other Spanish artists, notably Giuseppe Ribera, who had been to Italy, worked in Italy, and was very familiar with Caravaggio's work, and who, in fact, was a kind of conduit of Caravaggio's work, bringing Caravaggio's work back when he came to Spain, when he came home to Spain. This is one of a series of paintings of the five senses by Ribera, all of the senses. This is the one that relates to the sense of taste. And we can see the Caravaggio-like elements of realism. This is not an ideal perfect face and an ideal perfect body as Raphael and the other Renaissance artists had painted them. This is a very real, ordinary, everyday, and not particularly aristocratic looking individual. The people who are not upper class, who are not aristocrats, were very much part of the repertoire of Caravaggio and of the followers of Caravaggio, because that too would appeal to the ordinary people who came into the churches or who saw paintings elsewhere, and they could relate to the paintings in a way that had not been possible with the perfect beings that had been painted by Renaissance artists. Here, in the sense of taste, we see such a man enjoying a glass of wine and a plate of what is probably some kind of seafood with a roll, and holding a bottle of wine. Looks as though he's ready for some more. Now, another extremely realist element typical of Spanish art, even before the 17th century, is found in the paint in the sculptures that were made to go in churches in Spain. Very, very realistic sculpted figures, painted, not just simply left the color of wood or of stone. They were very often made of wood, but stone sometimes too, and painted to make them look even more real. Um, and sometimes even they had real clothing put on them to make them still more convincing in their illusion. This is one of the leading Spanish sculptors of the time, Juan Martinez Montañez. This is his statue of St. Christopher. Montañez, in fact, was closely connected with Pacheco, the teacher of Velázquez, and Pacheco actually painted some of the statues that were made by Montañez, so that Velázquez, through his teacher and through the art world in Seville at the time, was in close contact with extremely realistic works like this of St. Christopher, who carried, according to the Golden Legend, which is the stories of the saints that was written in the medieval era. St. Christopher was a huge man who carried people across a deep and difficult river and was asked by a little child to carry him across. And while he was in the middle of the river, the child suddenly became terribly, terribly heavy, so that St. Christopher could barely carry him across. When he got to the other side, the child revealed that he was the child Jesus, and that he was the whole world, which is why he had been so heavy to carry. That according to the Golden Legend. Now, Velázquez had a tradition behind him in Spanish art of a kind of painting called bodejones. Bodejones were paintings of scenes inside taverns or inside kitchens that usually showed food and preparation sometimes of food, and sometimes collections of food ready to be prepared, and people who are there preparing it as well. This is a painting of that type of work, the bodejones that Velázquez made, still very early in his career. Remember, he was born in 1599, so he was only 19 when he made this painting. Very accomplished painting. And it has, nevertheless, the bodegones quality, of course, of having food being prepared, young woman with a mortar and a pestle, plate of fish, a dish of eggs, and some garlic and other objects, pepper at the bottom. But also it has a religious scene in the upper right corner. That is the biblical parable that Jesus presented of himself in the house of Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha were followers and friends of Jesus. And according to this parable that Jesus spoke as reported in the New Testament, Martha, the older woman, was very annoyed at Mary because Martha was doing all the work of cleaning the house and preparing the food, while Mary was doing nothing but sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening. And Jesus told Martha that she should not complain, because learning about religion and learning about spirituality was just as important as cleaning the house and preparing the food. Now that scene is shown here in the upper right, but it's a puzzle, because is this another room that you're looking at through an opening in the wall? Or is it a painting hanging on the wall? Or is it in fact a vision in the mind of the young woman? Is this in fact Mary and Martha, as well as this being Mary and Martha? This is one of a number of paintings that Velázquez made throughout his career that have questions attached to them, because they can be interpreted in any number of different ways. This being an early painting by Velázquez is very real. You see extraordinary feeling for the texture of the metal, of the pestle, for instance, of the mortar and pestle, for the texture, the smooth skin of the fish, for the clothing and the flesh of the figures. Extremely realistic. And again, the background very, very close to us, except of course in this part, so that it's typical early Velázquez, very, very clearly, sharply painted with all the edges very sharp and clear and precise. No visible brush strokes at all. Everything very, very smoothly and fully painted in full detail, down to the wrinkles and to the details of the clothing. Now, there are precedents for that kind of painting. Spain was at this time under the rule of the Habsburg Empire. It was ruled by one branch of the Habsburg family. There were two branches. One had its headquarters in Austria, in Vienna, and the other branch of the Habsburg family had its headquarters in Spain, with the royal family in Spain being members of the Habsburg family. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs also ruled the southern Netherlands, the area that is called Flanders, the area that was called Flanders and is today Belgium. This was under the rule of the Spanish branch of the Habsburg Empire. And so there was a lot of connection, a lot of cultural connection between Flanders and Spain, and a lot of Flemish, that is art from Flanders, Flemish art was brought to Spain, and there were Spanish painters who went to Flanders to study art as well. Now, this is a Flemish painter, Joachim Buchelaar, who made a painting of the same subject as we just saw Velázquez paint. It's the same idea. We see a single woman here, a young woman, with a lot of food all over the table, and then a background not dark as in the Velázquez painting under the influence of Caravaggio, but instead with a doorway opening into a distant room where there is again a scene of Jesus in the house of Martha and Mary. So that the painting that Velázquez made has two elements in its background. It has the tradition of Flemish painting, as we just saw in the Buchelaar, but the style and the technique, the blank background and the figures very up close to us, coming from the art of Caravaggio. The probably most spectacular painting that Velázquez made of this type was made a couple of years later. And as you can see, it's called the Water Cellar of Seville. That is Velázquez's hometown. He was still living in Seville. It's very hot. Seville is in southern Spain. It's fairly close to the equator. In the summer, it's very, very hot. And there was no access to fresh water except from fountains, or from people who would gather water from the fountains into jugs and then sell it to customers who really needed a drink of water very badly. In this painting, we see that kind of situation where there is very much still present the effect of the art of Caravaggio. The water seller, the man who is selling the water, is an old man with a wrinkled face and kind of scruffy hair, scruffy beard, kind of tattered clothing. He's not aristocratic. He's from the lower classes, the poorer classes of the people, and he's selling a glass of fresh water from one of these jugs to a young boy, with another person more dimly seen in the background who is drinking the water that he has just bought. This painting again is very Caravagesque, but it's even more typical of Velázquez under the influence of Caravaggio. Caravagesque is that the figures are right up front. There's no background. We're not supposed to see into the distance. They are right up front, very close to us. The jug reaches out of the painting. The hand on the jug reaches out towards the outside to bring us into the painting, to make us able to relate to it. And even the table reaches out of the painting to our world, to the world of the spectator. The strong dark and light contrast called tenebrism. Tenebrism, that's Tenebrism. Strong contrasts of dark and light come out of the art of Caravaggio. But what is particularly Velázquez's contribution that you don't find to the same extent in Caravaggio is the feeling for the surfaces of things. The difference between this jug, which is glazed, although its surface has been pinched in as it was probably made on the potter's wheel, and it's smooth in its surface because of the glaze put on it. The difference between that and the glaze out for and the unglazed vase out here, where you can see the effect of having been turned on the potter's wheel. The remarkable effect of the light shining on the glass and through the glass that the boy is holding. The different kinds of heavy cloth that the old man is wearing and the lighter cloth of the collar behind. All of these interest in texture, the texture of the wood table, the feeling for that is typical Velázquez. It does not come to the same extent out of the art of Caravaggio. Now, in 1622 and 23, Velázquez was introduced to the King of Spain, Philip IV. Philip IV was born in 1605. So he was 6 years younger than Velázquez. They were pretty much in the same age range. The King of Spain was 6 years younger than Velázquez, and Velázquez was brought to the royal palace in Madrid. He left Seville to go to Madrid to the royal palace, and he was asked to paint a portrait of the king. He did. The king liked it very, very much, and he appointed Velázquez his official court artist in 1622. The next year, 1623, Velázquez, who by this time was married and had a couple of children, was moved with his family into the royal palace, and they remained there for the rest of his life. Velázquez remained the primary official court artist for King Philip IV, with his job being to make paintings for the king, principally portraits of the king and the royal family, but also other subjects as well. So that when Velázquez made this painting, he had already moved into the royal palace. He was already the official artist for the king. The painting is a kind of Velázquez variation on ancient Greek and Roman mythology. In ancient Greek and Roman mythology, Bacchus is the god of wine and revelry. And what Velázquez shows us here is young man who is supposed to be Bacchus, and he is giving wine to what are very obviously Spanish peasants, a group of Spanish peasants on the right side of the work. He's crowning one of them with a crown of leaves, and he himself wears a crown of leaves. And there is another figure behind him and another one in the lower corner, also all crowned with leaves. The crowning with leaves signifies that they celebrate the rites, the rituals of Bacchus. They are celebrating the god of wine. But this is a very down to earth kind of scene. And here again, we have the kind of question, the kind of puzzle that we see time and time again in the art of Velázquez. This figure looks so real. He doesn't look like a remote mythological being. Is he, in fact, a real young man who simply has taken off his clothes and is acting as a parody of the god Bacchus with all of these other figures in on the kind of amusing quality of the parody? Or is he really Bacchus, and are they happy because he's giving them wine and taking them away from the kind of ordinary humdrum lives that they normally live? Is this one of the peasants also, or is he a mythological figure? And the same for this figure who brings us into the work. I think at some point I had a slide that said repoussoir, but I can't see it on my screen. Repoussoir, which I wrote on one screen or other, that's Repoussoir, is a figure who is seen from in back and brings us into the work. This is a repoussoir, a figure seen from the back, bringing us into the work. This is a very Velázquez painting with its interest in surface texture, the texture of the clothing that these figures wear, the smooth painting of the flesh of the back of Bacchus figure, the glass that we see down at the bottom from its bottom. We're looking at it looking upward. The jug again with its glazed surface texture, and the different kind of fabric that the figures are wearing. This is a painting that has a great deal of excitement and yet a great deal of puzzle as well. The Velázquez Bacchus, in fact, again seems to show the effect of Velázquez's knowledge of Caravaggio. Caravaggio had made a painting of Bacchus. As you can see, over 30 years earlier, the Velázquez was made in the late 1620s, whereas this was 1595, so it's about 30 years later. The Bacchus probably was known, the Caravaggio to Velázquez, and certainly this is Caravaggio's painting of a model in the studio. You can see that he normally has clothing on because his face and his hands are darker in color than his body, so that he's a real human being, a kind of androgynous looking being, but nevertheless, which brings Bacchus down. And that is the kind of image of Bacchus that we see in the painting by Velázquez, still certainly showing a lot of the effect of the art. And that continues in Velázquez's painting as in this work. Now, in 1629, Velázquez went to Italy. He persuaded the king to send him to Italy. Velázquez was paid by the king to was given payment for his individual work, and clearly the king very, very highly valued Velázquez's art, and to send Velázquez to Italy, where he went and stayed for about a year, studying
We're trying to get her back. Can everyone see her?
No,
Lost her. We lost her. We're trying to get her back.
okay.
Your internet router is that might help.
Okay, I'm about as close as I can get, I think. Share. How do I get to share? All right, here it is. Okay. Okay. Now, it says my internet connection is unstable. All right. How is that? Is that okay now? Okay. All right. I hope it'll last. Okay. And now everybody can see it. Okay. Sorry for that internet issue. You can see me? You can see. Okay. The
Yes, we can see you.
connection. Okay, good. The realist element in Velázquez's art continues in this throughout the 1620s, and while he was in Italy, he was able certainly to study the great works of the Italian Renaissance, which is the reason that he wanted to go to Italy. And certainly he must have been struck by the art of Michelangelo, because while Velázquez was, after Velázquez came back from Italy, he made this painting of the god Mars, the Roman of war, resting. He was back in Madrid by this time, working for the king, but it certainly shows the effect of his having known and probably sketched, although we don't have many drawings by Michelangelo of Lorenzo de' Medici, which is from the Medici tombs in the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, as well as in Rome, because you can certainly see it's obviously very similar. But the Lorenzo de' Medici by Michelangelo shows us an ideal being.
Sorry again, everyone. We're working on the issues now. Please be patient, everyone. She'll be back on shortly.
Okay. I just unmuted, it says. And I'll start my video. Okay. I
Go ahead.
clicked on start video.
You're good.
Now I can't get to the top where.
There's some bad weather outside, which is contributing.
I need to get to the place where I can do the slideshow. That's covered up now by the screen. And
Which way are you looking at?
I'm looking at a screen where the gallery is covering up the,
Put the speaker view. Top left-hand side.
I'm sorry, what about that top left?
To the top right-hand side, there's a view options.
Yeah.
Click speaker. Not doing your PowerPoint.
No, my view options aren't there.
Your PowerPoint.
I see it, I see the PowerPoint, but it's not in a slideshow. It's just in, no.
Yeah, go click a slideshow format inside the PowerPoint.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Start the slideshow from inside the PowerPoint.
I can't get to the instruction for the slideshow. This is all the way up at the top. Wait, now it is. Okay, I got it now. Okay. Right. Is that all right? Can people hear me and see the presentation? Are people hearing?
Yes.
The hand raise
yes.
function, if you can see and hear it, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry for this. It's really annoying. But anyway, hopefully this will work out now. Let's all hope very hard. Anyway, I don't know at what point you stopped hearing me. I spoke about Velázquez having been to Italy in 1629 to 30, where he encountered the art of the Italian Renaissance, not only in Rome, but also in Florence. And where he must have seen this statue of Lorenzo de' Medici, which was one of several statues in the on the tombs of the Medici family in San Lorenzo in Florence by Michelangelo. And it's certain that he must have kept that either in his memory or perhaps on a sketch that he might have made, so that when he made this painting years later, some 10 years or so later, of the Roman god of war, Mars, he must have had the Michelangelo statue in mind. You can see that there is a certain degree of similarity in the pose of the two figures, but with the difference that the Michelangelo figure, as is typical of the Italian Renaissance, is an ideal figure, muscular and with a face that is smooth and perfect. And that the painting by Velázquez, on the other hand, looks like it's made of a studio model. The figure is not perfect. He has wrinkles around the middle of his abdomen, and there are kind of irregular edges to his skin of his arms and shoulders and legs. And he has this big, almost ludicrous kind of mustache, which is unusual for portrayals of Mars, so that he looks like a studio model posing as Mars. This is still, again, a very Caravagesque kind of concept in which the background is dark, in which the figure is very much in the foreground, and where the shield of Mars lying on the ground reaches out of the painting into the space of the spectator to make us relate very immediately to the figure. And of course, again, with those strong contrasts of dark and light that Velázquez had learned from the art of Caravaggio. But once more, the sense of the feel of the surface of things, the texture of the different kinds of cloth, of the pink cloth with its texture as differentiated from the smaller wrinkles and folds of the blue cloth that is worn there, the texture of the flesh, the texture of this kind of fur edging to the metal shield of Mars. All of this is very typical of Velázquez, the feel for the surface of things. We are feeling them with our eyes. One of the jobs that Velázquez had to fulfill was to make paintings of important events that took place in the life of in the official life of the royalty of the King of Spain. And one of the important events was the defeat of the Dutch city of Breda. Now, I mentioned that the Habsburg family, the Habsburg dynasty, which ruled Spain, also ruled Flanders. Flanders was the southern half of the region, which one time was united as all of Flanders, and which included a northern half too. At the time of the Protestant Reformation, the northern half of that region called Flanders broke away from Spain, broke away from the southern half of what had been Flanders, and declared itself a new country. That new country was called the United Provinces, more commonly known as Holland. And Holland broke away because it became a Protestant country, no longer under the rule of the kings of Spain, of the Habsburg monarchy, while the southern half of what had formerly been Flanders remained Flanders and remained under the rule of Spain and remained a Catholic country. That southern half is what is today Belgium, and the northern half is still today Holland. Now, the breakaway of the northern half of the United Provinces, otherwise known as the Dutch Republic, because it was a republic, not a monarchy, the Dutch Republic, it wasn't easy. Spain was not willing to let them go. What resulted from Holland breaking away from Spain was a long, many years long war between them, a long and bloody war in which Spain tried to retain control of Holland, but Holland ultimately was able to succeed in gaining its independence. One of the episodes of that war was when the Spanish sent an army came through France and through Flanders, which was the southern half, into the northern half, into Holland, into the Dutch city of Breda, which the Spanish saw was rebelling against Spain, in order to win back the city of Breda for the Spanish Empire. And in fact, they succeeded. The Spanish army was under the leadership of a general whose name was Ambrosio Spinola. He was Italian. He was an Italian merchant army leader. This is Spinola, who led the Spanish forces against Breda, and they were successful. They defeated the army of Breda, and they succeeded in winning Breda back for the Spanish Empire. That success was made official by the mayor of Breda, whose name was Justice of Nassau. Justice of Nassau, turning over the key of the city of Breda to Ambrosio Spinola. And this painting commemorates that event when the key to the city was turned over to the Spanish commander. Velázquez made it very clear that he wasn't there. He didn't see what happened, but he made it very clear that the Spanish general was very gallant and was congratulating the Dutch mayor for having put up a good fight and saying, well, we are your enemy, but we appreciate and we understand the effort that you have made. He looks gracious and understanding. This is the concept that Velázquez wanted to get across. He also wanted to get across that the Spanish army was in really good condition. Here's the Spanish army, and their lances are all upright. In fact, this painting has often used the nickname of the lances because the lances, the weapons of the Spanish army are in good order, whereas here is the kind of ragtag Dutch army, and their weapons, and there are far fewer of them, are not all standing up in good order, but they're kind of looking as though they're sparse and set apart from one another. So that this is a work that praises the victorious Spanish army and the behavior of the Spanish army with regard to their defeated enemies. As I said a little while ago, the main task of Velázquez as official court artist to the royal family, to the King of Spain and the royal family, was to make portraits, first of all, of the king. And he made something like about 34 portraits of King Philip IV, but also other members of the royal family. The king's wife, the first wife, died, and Velázquez had made portraits of her. And then Velázquez made portraits of the second wife, the second queen of Philip IV. And he made portraits of the royal family, of the children of Philip IV and of both of his queens, in fact. Philip had children from both of his marriages, and Velázquez made portraits of all of them as well. And he made portraits of some of the most important royal officials too, so that he was kept very, very busy as a portraitist. Now here are two portraits of one of the children of Philip IV, Don Baltasar Carlos, riding, horseback riding in both cases was a very, very important concept for the royal family. The concept circulated not only in Spain, but around other parts of Europe as well, that an individual who could subdue a powerful horse and a fiery and active horse was capable of subduing and ruling a kingdom, so that the rule of the horse by the rider becomes an emblem or a symbol of the ruler of the kingdom. Here, for instance, in this portrait of the young prince, who was about 7 years old at this time. At the time of both of these paintings, he was 7 or 8 years old. He's holding a baton of command here to show he's in charge, he's the ruler. The horse is executing a maneuver that was taught at riding school called a levade, L-E-V-A-D-E, where he rears up on his hind legs. But the young prince sits up very straight, very erect on the back of the prince, on the back of the horse, because he's totally in command of the horse. Here we see the prince in the same kind of pose, also sitting up very, very straight, the horse rearing up in the levade again at the riding school, which was connected to the palace. the royal palace in Madrid. And the riding instructor is here. He is handing a baton to the prime minister. This is the prime minister, who will in turn hand it to the young prince on the horse. On a balcony, watching the scene, are the king and queen and a servant. They're there to see their young son, who is being taught, basically not only taught to ride, but also being taught how to rule. He's taught the bearing of a prince and the activities of a prince and the duties of a prince as well. Hi. And as I said, horseback riding as a symbol of rulership, a symbol of the ability to rule, was the subject of many, many portraits by Velázquez. In fact, in the royal palace, which was built, a new palace was built for Philip IV, there was a room that was devoted to portraits of the royal family on horseback. The king and the princes and other members of the royal family were shown in that room. This is one of several portraits that Velázquez made of Philip IV on horseback. And on this side is, that prime minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, who was politically very, very powerful. He was the right-hand man of Philip IV. He was a leader of many of Philip's armies, and he was basically politically in charge of what was going on in Spain at the time. And he and the king were very, very close in terms of political, but also their personal activities. In both cases, we see the horse executing the levade. This painting of the king was in that room of the palace devoted to the royal family on horseback. This was not. The painting of the Count Duke was elsewhere. But they both show a distant background. Velázquez was really not that interested in backgrounds. You saw earlier he adopted the Caravagesque preference for backgrounds that are up close to the front of the work to pull you into the foreground and not extend into the distance. But here, in order to show that the figures on horseback were supreme over vast territories, that they were victorious, and in fact, in the case of the king, ruled over vast territories, Velázquez showed distant landscapes, but he didn't put a lot of detail into them. He didn't really have a great deal of interest in the landscape, and they're done in a relatively summary kind of fashion. Among the many, many portraits that Velázquez made of Philip IV, this is one of the most striking. The king was out at a location called Fraga, F-R-A-G-A, and so this is often called the Fraga portrait of Philip. He was there to review his troops. Velázquez shows him in a very elaborate costume and holding a baton of command in one hand, his hat in the other, and typical for the preference of Velázquez, the background is dark. He liked that. That was carried over from his Caravagesque earlier kind of works of art. The face of Philip is painted in great detail. You can see all of the detail of his features, of the quality of his skin, of his hair. But when it comes to the clothing, we see a very different kind of treatment. Velázquez is still fascinated by the feel of surfaces, by the feel of the silk sleeves, by the feel of the embroidery on the front of the cloak, by the quality of the linen and lace of the collar that the king is wearing, But now, instead of painting it in minute detail, he is allowing the brushwork to show. The strokes of his brush evoke, suggest the quality of the fabric. They suggest the folds, they suggest the shining quality of the silk, but they do not portray it in detail. The same thing is true for the way that he portrays the embroidery. And you can see here the brush strokes, the dots and dabs of white that suggest the embroidery, the dabs of red and of maroon and of kind of grayish tone, all of them giving you the impression that this is a heavy, thick embroidered fabric, but without painting it in detail. This kind of technique is called painterly. Velázquez has adopted a painterly technique to evoke this kind of treatment. And from here on in, he uses it more and more. This was made in 1644. He was 45 years old. And from this point on, he uses this technique more and more extensively. He not only made portraits of the royal family, but he made portraits of the other members of the palace, the other people who lived in the palace, many of them the court jesters, who were called fools, and of dwarfs. It seems very inhumane to us, but royalty in the 17th century, not only in Spain, but elsewhere, particularly in England, they had court dwarfs. The dwarfs were considered to be somewhere between human and non-human, and they were there to provide entertainment and amusement for the royal family and for the guests of the royal family as well. They were well treated, they were well housed and well fed and well clothed, but they were, as I said, considered somewhat subhuman. And this is one of those court dwarfs who was painted by Velázquez. Velázquez paints him with his feet sticking out at us, which of course is again that Caravagese technique, but at the same time it serves to emphasize how short his legs were. And he has the hands of the dwarf sort of folded under so that they look more like animal-like paws rather than human hands. At the same time, the face has an expression of a kind of sadness and a kind of pensiveness, even though he was well housed and well clothed. He was certainly treated in a way that no human being really would enjoy being treated. And Velázquez has captured that certainly in this portrait. You'll notice the painting technique is now that painterly technique. You can see that in the clothing of Sebastian de Mora. Same technique we just saw in the portrait of the king. Velázquez asked the king to send him to Italy again, 20 years after his first trip. His first trip was in 1629 when he was overcome by the magnificence of Italian Renaissance art, and it showed certainly in his work, but also he wanted to go back to Italy and study more there. And so he persuaded the king to send him back in 1649. When he was in Italy, by the time he came to Italy, he had already had grown a very fine reputation. Velázquez had acquired a European-wide reputation by 1649 because of all the remarkable paintings and especially the portraits he had made at the royal court of Spain. And so he was commissioned to make the portrait of the reigning Pope, Innocent X. And he did make that portrait in 1650. In terms of its arrangement, in terms of its composition, it has a great deal in common with the portrait that Raphael had made in the early 16th century of Pope Julius II, but Velázquez's own characteristics really shine out from that portrait. The Raphael is a fine portrait of Julius II, but the Velázquez portrait shows us the person who was Julius II. We have a sense not only of what he looked like, but of what he was like. He came from a family of lower class peasants, and he never lost a kind of suspiciousness. There's a kind of suspiciousness or even a kind of hostility in that face that made some people in Velázquez's circle worry that the Pope was not going to accept that painting because it did not make him look like a pleasant person. But the Pope liked it, and he kept the painting. And so the painting was very, very in high regard in the Vatican because the Pope appreciated it. In terms of the painting technique, it is this painterly treatment par excellence. I haven't shown you any detailed close-ups, but the sense of the satin of this garment that the Pope is wearing is extraordinary. The starched collar, the linen collar, the undergarment, the skirt garment of its many, many, many pleated folds of fabric, all individual, not portrayed in detail. These are all done with painterly strokes of the brush that create the illusion of the feel of the fabric. You're feeling that satin with your eyes, and the gold trim on the Pope's throne. These are not painted in detail, these little decorations on the throne. These are done with dots and dabs and dashes of yellow and white against the background red that Velázquez has painted. So that his painterly technique here reaches a kind of peak of extraordinary success. While he was in Spain, he made a portrait of the man that he brought with him. This man, Juan de Pareja, was in fact the slave of Velázquez. He was a Moor from Africa, and he was a slave. There were many slaves in Spain at the time, and Velázquez taught him to paint. He came to Italy with Velázquez, and there is a document that was only recently discovered in recent years. In 1653, Velázquez completed a document that set him free, that said he was no longer a slave, and Juan de Pareja went on to become an artist in his own right. Velázquez taught him to paint, set him free, and Pareja became a successful artist on his own. This painting, you may know, it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They paid an extraordinarily high amount in order to get it. And it is done in the remarkable style that Velázquez had achieved by this time. We have again a sense of the personality of this man, not only what he looked like, but what he was like. There's a kind of thoughtfulness here and a kind of openness also. But besides the sense of personality, there is this evocation of the fabric, of the clothing, evocation of the lace and of the linen, and the gleam of the light on the skin of this man. That is all part of the painterly technique that Velázquez had developed to an amazing extent by this time. While he was in Rome, Velázquez, well, he actually probably began it before he went to Rome, but he completed it in Rome, the only nude that he ever painted. Nude paintings were frowned upon in Spain at the time. There were a lot of nude paintings in Italy and in France, but Spain was very much under the control of the Inquisition. The Inquisition, which was there to promote the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and which was determined to root out anything that might be considered immoral, did not allow the painting of nudes. But Velázquez, who was the official court artist, was protected by that reason, for that reason, and so he was able to paint a nude, but the only nude he ever painted was this one. It's supposed to be Venus, who is looking into a mirror, held by her son, the little god Cupid. It's been pointed out many times that she could not possibly see her face in the mirror. The angle at which she sat would not show her the face, so the face is meant to be seen by the spectator rather than by the figure in the painting. You'll notice that the flesh is painted very, very softly. The texture of the flesh is very, very beautifully evoked as contrasted to the texture of the hair, the satin and silk of the various kinds of cloth around, evoked also by Velázquez's painterly technique. Now, in 1622 and 23, Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens, who was from Flanders, came to Spain on a diplomatic mission, and he met Velázquez. And he and Velázquez spent some time together. And Rubens, who was from Flanders, made this painting also of Venus with a mirror. He had made it about 10 years earlier, 8 or 10 years before he came to Spain. It's quite possible that the rear view of Venus looking into a mirror, and this time accompanied by a servant and again by a Moorish, probably slave, this painting might have been known to Velázquez, who, like Rubens, showed the back view and showed the Venus looking at her face in a mirror. However, there's a great difference. The Rubens Venus is the Rubens ideal female type, very different from the Velázquez, which is a much sleeker and more svelte and certainly more graceful image of Venus. The long, graceful lines of her body that rise and fall are echoed by the long, graceful lines of the draperies behind and underneath her. So it's a much more graceful image than the Rubens, although it has a lot in common with it. The most famous painting by Velázquez, this huge painting called Las Meninas, which means the maids in waiting. It's another Velázquez painting that is open to all sorts of interpretation and has been written about endlessly and interpreted endlessly because of what is happening. What we see is the studio of Velázquez in the royal palace. This is he had a big studio in which he could work. And here's a self-portrait. He shows himself with his brush and with his palette working on a huge painting. This painting is 10.5 feet high, and the painting he's working on looks like it's about 10.5 feet high also. Also in his studio is the little Infanta, the Princess Margarita, one of the children of the king and his second wife. And she's being attended by 2 maids in waiting, which is where the title of the painting, The Maids in Waiting, Las Meninas, comes from. She also has her 2 court dwarfs. I don't know, I can't see that on this side because I have the gallery view, but on the right, there are 2 court dwarfs who are there just to amuse the princess, and a big dog, so that the dwarfs and the dog are all her pets together. And she has her nurse and her tutor in the background and an attendant of the palace in the distance. By this time, Velázquez had become a rather important court official. and he was given charge of a lot of the arrangements for all of the rooms of the palace and the activities that were going on in the palace. And as such, he was entitled to ask for membership in an order of chivalry. He didn't get it yet this year. He only got it a couple of years later, but he painted that cross of the Order of Chivalry on his costume anyway. He was hoping to get it. This painting has been called an allegory of art. It is really about the art of painting rather than simply a picture of Velázquez and the princess with her attendants. It shows us the act of painting. It also shows us a mirror on the back wall of the studio, and in the mirror we see the reflection of the king and the queen, so that we have the impression that what is Velázquez painting? He's painting what he's looking at. He's looking out of the painting at where we are standing, but really that's where the king and queen are standing as they're reflecting in the mirror. So this painting is about Velázquez painting the king and queen, who are reflected on his canvas just as they are reflected in the mirror. At least it's been interpreted that way, and that seems like a perfectly valid interpretation. And then on the wall up above in his studio are two paintings by the son-in-law of Velázquez. Velázquez had two daughters, one of whom died in infancy, but the other one lived to adulthood and married. And her husband was a pupil of Velázquez. These two paintings are by his son-in-law, and they show classical gods, that is Greek and Roman gods, who are performing activities that relate to art. One of them shows the contest between the god Apollo and a human being named Marsyas, who Apollo won, Marsyas lost, and he was punished by being flayed alive. And this shows that the making of the art of music is a godlike activity. The other painting is the story of Arachne, who was challenged to a weaving the goddess Minerva was challenged by Arachne to a weaving contest, and Minerva won and turned Arachne into a spider. So that in both cases, a god, in this case, Minerva was practicing the art of weaving, and in this case, Apollo was practicing the art of music. But the idea is that the creation of art and the practicing of art are the activities of the gods. So that this painting, which is so large that the figures in it are life-size, these are life-size figures, is proclaiming the importance of art. And it is a meditation also on the significance of art in the world. This is a detail showing you the head of the little princess, where you can see the painterly technique in full bloom of Velázquez's art. The hair is not painted as strands of hair. It's instead strokes of various colors, of white and of yellow and of brown and of tan. The shining hair on top is made of areas of black and white and yellow. And the flower in her hair is dots and dabs. The flower on her bodice, the treatment of the border at the top of her dress, of the ribbons on the side of her dress, all of these look very real. They look like these are real elements of clothing. You would say, yes, those are flowers in her hair. Those are flowers on her bodice, but they're all done in this amazing painterly technique that Velázquez pioneered, and that very, very obviously is the forerunner of what the French Impressionists were going to do 200 years later. The French Impressionists were fascinated by the art of Velázquez, and they adopted that painterly technique. I'll show you an example of that in a little while. Again, a work by Velázquez that shows the interest in his work of enigma, of puzzle, of multiple levels of interpretation coexisting at the same time. This is again a work that can be interpreted in many, many different ways. It shows a tapestry weaving studio where we see a woman with a spinning wheel, and she's spinning the raw material into thread that will be used to make tapestry. Here, another younger woman who is winding thread around that's going to be used to sew the tapestries. And then there are other details, balls of yarn above, and figures engaged in various activities. So it's a scene of thread spinning and of the preparation for making tapestry. There's also yarn hanging on the wall to be used for tapestry. But then up above, there are some steps leading to an upper level. This is a scene in the tapestry workshop of the Royal Palace. There was a tapestry workshop in the Royal Palace in Madrid, and up above on a platform, there are some ladies of the Royal Palace wearing their court costumes. You can see the kind of satin of the costume, the three women here. But if we look further back, we see a female figure wearing a helmet and holding a baton of command and a shield. She is the goddess Minerva. And there's another female figure with her, so that this seems to be the story, again, as in the painting we just looked at a little while ago, of the story of Minerva and Arachne, who engaged in that weaving contest that ended with Minerva turning Arachne into a spider. But in fact, is that happening in front also? There is a young woman here who is working with yarn, and there's an older woman here, which was the guise that Minerva first took when she first appeared to Arachne. So it could be that the story is happening in the front, and then it's happening in back again. And these mythological figures with women of the court palace, of the palace, looking at the mythological story as it's happening, and with one further level, because in back there is a tapestry that has been woven, and the tapestry is a copy of a painting by Titian. The painting by Titian is called The Rape of Europa, and it is a story that comes out of Greek mythology in which the god Zeus took the form of a white bull and carried off Minerva, a young girl, from the shore of the country of her father, leaving her companions behind her, and Zeus carried her off to his kingdom to be his lover at the time. Here in the painting by Velázquez, we see the elements of the cupids up in the sky, of the arm and of the cloth of Minerva, and a little bit of the bull that is Jupiter carrying her off. So we have many levels going on. We have the weaving in front, we have the court ladies, we have the story of Minerva and Arachne, and we have the story of we have the tapestry that has been woven there. Again, a multi-level, multi-meaning painting that is typical of the subtlety and of the depth of thought that characterizes the works of Velázquez. Now, as I said, the French Impressionists were fascinated by his work. There was a great vogue for Spain in the middle of the 19th century. And a lot of artists, and particularly Manet, among others, wanted to take subjects from Spain. Manet painted bullfighters and he painted Spanish dancers, of which this is one example. And in this painting by Manet from the mid-19th century, we see that painterly technique with the visible brushstrokes that Manet and the other French Impressionists adopted from looking at the works of Velázquez. But beyond that, the influence of Velázquez extended into the 20th century. Picasso made over 50 paintings based on the Las Meninas painting by Velázquez. He adopted it, he changed it, he turned it into a cubist kind of treatment. And this is one of the cubist paintings by Velázquez, where we can see the elements of Las Meninas converted to a cubist technique. The window that was on the right in the Velázquez painting is there. Here's the big canvas on which Velázquez is working. Here's Velázquez with that big cross on his black costume. Here is the little princess, Margarita. And here are the serving women who are watching over her, along with the nurse and the tutor who are there with her as well. So this is Velázquez's take on, this is Picasso's take on Velázquez, whose influence has extended into the 20th century and no doubt will continue to be extended after that as well. I thank you very much. I'm sorry for all the technological difficulties, but I hope that you've been able to bear with me anyway. Thank you. Are there any questions? Anybody still here?
If you have a question, anybody wants to speak, they can unmute themselves.
You can unmute yourself, yes, if you want to ask a question. I know I ran way over, but that was to make up for the lost time.
Okay, since there doesn't appear any questions, thank you again, anybody.
There are 2 questions in the
Go ahead.
chat.
There are in the chat. Okay, now how do I get to the chat? I can't see chat here.
I can read them to you. 1 second.
Can you read them?
Yeah, if I can bring them up. I guess one of your earlier slides, you mentioned La Meninas. Hope I'm saying it right.
Las
Someone asked
Meninas?
where that was.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Someone want to ask where it was in the painting.
I'm
Daryl
sorry,
Learned want
where
to
the
ask
painting
a
is?
question.
It's in the Prado in Madrid. Is that the question? Where is it?
Yes.
It's in the Prado in Madrid, the museum, the big Royal Art Museum there. Well, National Art Museum now. Yeah. Is there another question?
When are we going live and in person?
What was that? I didn't hear that. Oh, when we're going in person? That's a good question. You
Soon
prefer
enough.
in person. Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much. It was very informative.
Oh, you're quite welcome. You're quite welcome. Good. Okay. Is that it?
Thanks, very enjoyable.
Thank you.
I'm dead.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for hanging on. Really appreciate your patience.
Indeed.
You're welcome, Maurice.
So take care, everyone. Have a good night. And thank you again, Ann Betty. And we look forward to seeing the rest of you soon.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
You sound so amazing.